Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases in history. Today, we will uncover the dark secrets of Hollow Ridge, a place where the truth was buried along with the records that were supposed to preserve it. In the Appalachian Mountains, where mist clings to the slopes like a secret kept for too long, lies a valley bearing a name whispered only when necessary: Hollow Ridge. A patch of land in West Virginia that in 1917 witnessed events so disturbing that the county archives themselves seem to have conspired to erase them from collective memory. The story we are about to explore began not with an obvious crime, but with something far more insidious: the systematic disappearance of official documents, property records, and certificates mentioning a specific man, a farmer who, according to fragmented testimonies found in personal diaries and letters preserved by chance, had committed acts that defied human comprehension. The Appalachian region has always been marked by its isolation. Entire communities lived separated from one another by miles of dense forest, connected only by narrow trails that snaked through the mountains. Hollow Ridge was the same. Located in Webster County, the area was home to scattered farms where families lived off the cultivation of tobacco and corn, the raising of pigs and chickens, and the seasonal hunting that the forests offered. Life there followed a rhythm dictated by the seasons, by the harshness of winter and the uncertain generosity of summer. People knew each other by surnames, by the lands they had occupied for generations, by agreements sealed with handshakes, and by a word that was worth more than any signed document. But in 1917, something changed. The county registry office records began to show inexplicable gaps: pages torn out, deed books with entire blank sections, as if they had never been filled in, birth and death certificates that simply no longer existed. At the center of this documentary void, a name appeared and disappeared like smoke: Ezekiel Thornwood, the Hollow Ridge rancher whose property stretched across more than 400 hectares of mountainous land, including a significant portion of virgin forest that no one dared to enter anymore. The few records that survived this mysterious purge reveal a man who arrived in the region around 1905, buying land with money whose origin was never publicly questioned. Thornwood wasn't from there. His speech carried an accent that some identified as coming from the Deep South, perhaps Louisiana or Mississippi, but he never confirmed nor denied it. He built his house away from the main road, atop a hill from where the entire valley could be seen. A dark, wooden structure with narrow windows that seemed to observe more than reveal. Around it, barns, sheds, and a series of smaller buildings whose exact function remained a mystery to the nearest neighbors, who nevertheless lived miles away. Thornwood kept his distance, but not entirely reclusive. He came to town every 2 or 3 weeks to buy food, sell crops, and sometimes hire temporary workers to help with repairs or the harvest. People could see him during these times. He was a tall man, thin as a winter twig, with clear eyes that seemed to look at everything and everyone with an uncomfortable intensity. He didn't talk much, paid well and in cash, and always left before conversations got too long. People who worked on Thornwood's farm gave vague and contradictory accounts. Some people said the work was hard but honest, and that the farmer only cared about them as a professional. Some people, on the other hand, talked about strange feelings. The smell that kept coming from one of the faraway sheds, which was said to be like a mix of damp earth and rusty metal. And the sounds that echoed through the valley at night, which could have been wind rustling through the trees or something else. And then there were the rules. Thornwood established clear boundaries about where workers could move around. He made it very clear when he hired him that some parts of the property were off limits. Anyone who broke the rules would be fired right away, without pay. Hollow Ridge, like many other mountain communities, got its work done through informal networks of information, like talking at church on Sundays, running into people on the road, and visiting neighbors who lived far away. People started talking about Thornwood through these networks. Nothing specific, never direct accusations, but that kind of distrust that builds up slowly until it becomes a deep well of unease. They said that the people who worked for him changed after that. They got quieter, more anxious, and stopped talking about what happened. Some people just left the area without saying goodbye, leaving behind things and relationships, as if they were running away from something they couldn't name. Something happened in 1912 that made these doubts even stronger. Martin Dalton, a seasonal worker who had been living on the Thornwood farm for almost 6 months, came to the county sheriff's house in the middle of the night. He was clearly shaken, sweating even though it was October, and he insisted on making a formal statement. William Harrove, the sheriff, took Dalton inside and heard what he had to say. But here's the most important thing. There is no official record of this conversation. The incident book from that time was one of many records that were lost from the archives. We only know what we do because Harrove's wife wrote a letter to a sister who lived in Ohio. The letter was kept by chance in a family collection. She says in the letter that her husband was clearly upset for days after that night. He went to Thornwood's farm with 2 deputies but came back without making any arrests or filing a formal complaint. Dalton left the area soon after and was never heard from again. Harrove, when questioned by curious onlookers, only said that there was not enough evidence to proceed with any investigation. But something changed in him. Those who knew him well noticed how he began to avoid going near Hollow Ridge, how he changed conversations whenever the name Thornwood was mentioned. The following years brought an unsettling quiet. Thornwood continued his activities, the farm prospered modestly, and life in the region followed its slow and predictable course. But beneath the surface of this apparent normality, something was brewing. Workers continued to come and go, some staying only days before abruptly leaving. Stories accumulated on the fringes of the community, never solid enough to generate action, but impossible to ignore completely. There were mentions of underground constructions on the property, cellars or tunnels that Thornwood supposedly had dug for purposes he never explained. Some claimed to have seen lights moving through the forest in strange patterns at dusk, as if someone were performing some kind of ritual or ceremony. World War I brought change even to remote places like Hollow Ridge. Men were drafted, the local economy suffered, and the attention of the authorities turned to issues bigger than the mysteries of an eccentric farmer. It was in this context, in 1917, that events finally reached a point of no return. What exactly happened that year remains shrouded in mystery, but we know it involved the arrival of an outside investigator, someone who didn't belong to the region and who therefore wasn't subject to the same fears and hesitations that paralyzed the locals. This investigator, whose name appears in fragments of correspondence as Samuel Brennan, was allegedly sent by a government office related to the administration of federal lands. His official mission involved cataloging rural properties for census and taxation purposes, a bureaucratic task that led him to travel to various isolated farms throughout the Appalachian. Brennan was methodical, polite, and deeply committed to his work. He carried notebooks where he noted everything: property dimensions, land conditions, number of buildings, state of access roads. For him, each farm was just another piece of information to be processed and filed in his records. Brennan didn't expect anything out of the ordinary when he got to Hollow Ridge one afternoon in March. The mountains were starting to wake up to spring, which brought with it the hesitant green that comes before summer's full bloom. Brennan had to leave his carriage on the main road and walk the last few miles to the Thornwood estate because the road was steep and not well kept. He wrote this down in his notebook, saying that it was hard to get to and that this must have made it harder to get farm goods to the markets. Thornwood greeted him with the cold politeness that he was known for. He gave Brennan water, let him look around the main barns and farmland, and answered questions with great accuracy. Everything seemed to be going well until Brennan looked at his first maps and saw that there were differences between the official property lines and what Thornwood said he owned. There was a lot of land, about 80 acres of thick forest north of the main house, that wasn't listed on any official purchase record or deed. Thornwood looked uncomfortable for the first time when asked about this. He gave a vague and contradictory answer. He talked about verbal agreements with past owners, papers that were said to have been lost in a fire at the registry office years ago, and local land tenure customs that didn't always follow the law. Brennan, who was used to dealing with similar situations in other rural areas, didn't think this was anything out of the ordinary at first. Land in the Appalachians changed hands in ways that often didn't go through official channels. He just pointed out the difference and asked Thornwood to fix it as soon as they could. But then the request came that changed everything. Brennan, as he always does, said he wanted to walk around the edges of the property, including the wooded area in question. He wanted to check the conditions of the land himself and find natural landmarks that could be used as reference points for future surveys. It was a fair request that was a big part of his job. Thornwood's response was quick and strong. He flatly refused, saying that the forest was dangerous because it was full of hidden ravines and wild animals. He said that he hardly ever went there and would never let a visitor take the risk. Brennan felt more than just professional curiosity when Thornwood's refusal was so strong and his voice was almost desperate. The investigator chose not to push the issue at that time. He thanked them for their hospitality, finished his notes on the places he had looked at, and left, saying he would be back in a few weeks to finish the survey. But the seed of doubt had been sown. Brennan was a detail-oriented person who had been taught to spot inconsistencies, and something about Thornwood's reaction didn't make sense. While he was staying at an inn in the closest town, he started to ask questions in a quiet way. He talked to merchants, the blacksmith, and the innkeeper, and that's how the story started to get to him. Everyone had a different story to tell, but the same themes came up over and over. Thornwood's isolation, the workers who left without warning, the sounds at night, the parts of the farm that were off limits, and the incident with Martin Dalton years ago. Brennan, who was naturally skeptical, first thought a lot of it was just small-town gossip and rural superstition. But the more he looked into it, the more he saw that the inconsistencies were consistent. There were patterns in the stories, with details that were the same no matter where they came from. Most importantly, people were obviously scared when they talked about the farmer of Hollow Ridge. The investigator chose to look for Sheriff Harrove. From the beginning, their meeting was tense. It was clear that Harrove didn't want to talk about Thornwood, but Brennan had the law on his side and knew how to use it. When asked, the sheriff finally said that there were suspicions that something strange had been reported years before, but there was no solid proof to support any legal action. Harrove became visibly uncomfortable when Brennan asked about the official records from that time. He said that the registry office had trouble keeping things organized and that files often went missing in small, poor counties. He also said that many documents had been lost over the years. But there was something about how Harrove spoke that made his words seem heavy and made him pause, as if he knew something that others didn't. Brennan knew he was up against a man who was torn between what he thought was right and what he thought was smart, as well as between duty and fear. The sheriff ended the talk with a hint of a threat. He said that Hollow Ridge was a place where smart people didn't get involved, that there were things in the mountains that were better left alone, and that the law couldn't or shouldn't always reach every corner. It was strange advice coming from a representative of justice, and it only made Brennan more determined. Brennan spent the next few days doing a silent investigation that was almost an obsession. He went to the county registry office in person to ask for access to the property records for Hollow Ridge. What he found was troubling. Missing pages from the deed books where Thornwood's records should have been, certificates with dates that didn't make sense in terms of time, and documents that talked about other documents that didn't exist. It was as if someone had spent years carefully removing Ezekiel Thornwood's name from the official records, but they hadn't been able to get rid of all the evidence. There were still pieces left. Vague hints and documentary shadows that hinted at something much bigger than just a lack of organization in the government. The clerk, an old man named Preston Walsh, grew more and more nervous as he watched Brennan flip through the old books. At last, when they were alone in the archive, Walsh came up to them and spoke in a low voice. He said he had worked there for more than 30 years and had seen strange nighttime visits during that time. People would show up after hours with vague authorizations and ask to see certain records, pages that would mysteriously disappear, and important people in the community putting pressure on people to say that certain documents were lost or damaged. Walsh was too scared to ask questions or report it, but he felt guilty about it. He knew he was involved in something bad, but he also knew that keeping quiet would keep him safe. This new information changed the whole course of Brennan's investigation. He wasn't just dealing with a strange farmer on a remote property anymore. He was up against a conspiracy of silence that involved many levels of the community. Someone had a lot to lose if the truth about Thornwood came out, and that person had worked hard to make sure that documentary proof was destroyed. Brennan couldn't stop thinking about the simple but scary question. What could be so bad that someone would go to such lengths to erase it? He decided to look for other sources of information, like letters, diaries, and church records from the area. He found out that the Hollow Ridge Baptist Church kept its own records of births, marriages, deaths, and other events involving members of the congregation. Reverend Marcus Caldwell, the pastor, was in his 40s and had tired eyes that looked like they had seen more than they wanted to. At first, he didn't want to let Brennan look at the records, but after a long talk about moral duty and the importance of truth, he finally agreed. The church records showed patterns that were troubling. Since Thornwood moved to the area, a lot of people had left without warning. It was as if families had disappeared from the records. One entry talked about temporary workers, but they never came back. What was most disturbing was that a lot of these names matched up with people who, according to the stories Brennan had gathered, had worked for Thornwood at some point. Reverend Caldwell looked at the records with a sad look on his face and finally said that he had prayed for years that his suspicions were wrong. But deep down, he knew that something very wrong was going on in those mountains. Brennan also found letters in a collection owned by the local historical society. One of them, written by a traveling professor in 1914, talked about going to Hollow Ridge and how uneasy the whole area felt. The professor wrote about talking to people who lived nearby who spoke in hushed tones about the farmer on the hill. He also wrote about how people avoided looking in the direction of that property when they drove by and how children were told never to go near those lands. The professor said something very revealing. It's as if everyone knew a terrible secret, but no one dared to say it out loud, as if the very words could bring about horrible consequences. With this growing pile of circumstantial evidence, Brennan made a choice that would change everything that came after. He would go back to the Thornwood farm, but this time he wouldn't tell anyone and he wouldn't be alone. He convinced 2 federal officials who were passing through the area to go with him, saying that there were serious problems that needed to be looked into right away. They were outsiders who didn't know anyone in the area and didn't have the deep-seated fears that kept the people of Hollow Ridge from acting. To them, it was just another piece of paperwork that might or might not show something important. It was a cloudy morning in April when they went back to the ranch for the second time. The fog made the mountains look like ghosts, and the air was cool and damp like it is in the spring in the Appalachians. Thornwood opened the door and looked at them with a look that was both surprised and something darker, more planned. Brennan showed them his credentials and said that they needed to check out the whole property, including all the buildings and wooded areas. It wasn't a request. It was an official notice from the federal government that had the power of law. The farmer tried to argue by saying he had done nothing wrong, and that he had rights to his property and privacy, but the deputies were not willing to listen. They were allowed to do the inspection with or without his help. Thornwood knew he had to do it. At that moment, something changed in his eyes. They became cold and resigned, which Brennan took to mean that he accepted what was going to happen. The farmer put on a coat and said he would go with them, but they would regret bothering him. It was a strange phrase that could mean a lot of different things. The main barns and sheds were the first things to be checked. At first glance, everything looked normal. Farm tools, bags of grain, and equipment in different states of repair. But as they got closer to the buildings on the edges of the property, the mood changed. Thornwood said that one shed was empty and only used for storage from time to time. When the deputies broke down the locked door, they found something else. The inside was split up into weird compartments, which were small, closed-off spaces that didn't seem to have a purpose. There were marks and deep scratches in the wood on the walls, as if something or someone had tried to get out. There were chains on beams, and there were metal things whose purposes were very unclear. Brennan's stomach tightened as he looked at those compartments. He asked Thornwood directly what that building was for. The farmer didn't say anything for a long time, and when he finally did, it sounded rehearsed and empty. He said he used those areas to keep sick animals away from the other animals. The chains were used to keep pigs that were acting very aggressively under control while they were being treated by a vet. The marks on the walls were there because animals in cages act in a certain way. He said that everything made sense, but his voice was tense, which went against the naturalness he was trying to show. The deputies looked at each other. They were smart enough to know when something didn't make sense, but they also knew that suspicions weren't proof. There was nothing in that shed that could be called clearly against the law. Yes, it's disturbing and strange, but not always illegal. Brennan insisted on continuing the inspection, especially in the wooded area that Thornwood had said was off-limits. The rancher tried one last time to talk them out of it by saying how hard the land was and how easy it would be to get lost in the thick trees. But the men had already made up their minds. The forest that surrounded the northern part of the property was old and thick. Most of the sunlight was blocked by huge trees, which made it always dark, even in the middle of the day. There were thick layers of dead leaves on the ground that had built up over decades, maybe even centuries. It was the kind of place that looked like it hadn't been touched by people and was still in perfect condition. But as they got closer, Brennan started to see small signs of life. Marks on trees that looked like they were guiding them, and trails that were almost invisible that snaked through the plants. After about half an hour of walking, they found the first hidden building. It was a small building that was half buried in the ground and covered by plants that had grown over it over the years. It was a cabin or shelter that anyone who wasn't looking for it would have easily missed. A rusty padlock kept the door shut. Thornwood, who was a few meters behind the group, watched in complete silence. One of the deputies used a tool he had with him to break the padlock. The door creaked and groaned as it opened. The inside was dark and cold, and it smelled like dirt and decay, which is what places that have been closed for a long time smell like. There were boxes stacked against the walls and covered with tarpaulin that would not let water in. Brennan opened one and found clothes, papers, and small things that clearly belonged to different people, like pocket watches, worn leather wallets, and faded pictures of people he didn't know. It was like a bunch of lives that had been cut short, with physical memories of people who were no longer there to claim them. Each box had things from different people in it, and they were all arranged in a way that was very disturbing. Thornwood finally spoke, and his voice was strangely calm given what was going on. He said that these things belonged to workers who had left the farm over the years without taking their things with them. He kept them, hoping that they would come back or get in touch with him to get them back. He said it was an act of preservation, not hiding. But the amount was disturbing. There were dozens of sets of things that belonged to dozens of people who just left and left everything behind. Brennan knew that poor people who worked temporary jobs didn't easily give up their few things. Someone might only have a watch as a family heirloom, and photos were priceless. No one would willingly leave all of that behind. The search went even further into the woods. They discovered other structures that were similar and had more evidence of the same kind inside them. They found something else, too. An artificial clearing where trees had been cut down on purpose at some point in the past. There was a hole in the ground in the middle of this clearing, as if something big had been buried there and then the ground had settled over time. One of the deputies, who was naturally curious, started to dig with the shovel they had brought. He didn't have to dig very deep before he hit something that stopped him. Wood, a buried structure. It took a lot of hard work over the course of many hours to find out what was under the ground. It was like a room underground, made of thick boards and beams to make it stronger. The entrance was closed, but not as carefully as the other buildings. When they finally got it open, they saw a room that looked like it had been used as a storage room or warehouse. But for what? There were stains on the walls inside that showed they had been used for a long time, which suggested dampness and time. There were hooks attached to the beams, empty containers piled up in a corner, and tools whose purpose wasn't clear right away. Thornwood, who had been quiet during the digging, finally spoke up. He tried to get away by taking a few steps toward the forest as if he wanted to run away. The deputies quickly stopped him and held him tightly as he started to speak quickly, almost incoherently. He told them they wouldn't understand, and that there were reasons for everything. He said he had only done what was necessary. His speech was broken up, moving from one topic to another without any clear connection. He talked about things that needed to be done, experiments that needed certain materials, and knowledge he had gained through studies that most people would consider off-limits. The deputies took Thornwood back to the main house, but Brennan stayed in the woods, carefully writing down everything he found. He took pictures, drew detailed pictures in his notebooks, and gathered samples of things he found in the underground buildings. He knew he would need strong proof to make a case that would hold up in court. But the more he looked into it, the more he realized that what he was up against couldn't be explained in a normal way. Not only were there a lot of hidden structures and strange objects, but there was also a strong sense that this place had seen things that changed the land itself. When Brennan got back to Thornwood's house in the late afternoon, he saw deputies looking through the main rooms. They had found a great library, at least for a farmhouse that was far away from other buildings. There were hundreds of books on dark wood shelves, but they weren't just regular books about farming or popular fiction. They were old books about medical practices that are no longer used, philosophical essays about the nature of human consciousness, and how-to guides that modern science had given up on because they were unethical or didn't work. Thornwood also kept personal notebooks in which he wrote down detailed notes about people's behavior, how they reacted physically, and how long they could last in different situations. The writings showed that the person who wrote them was obsessed with figuring out strange things about human life. Thornwood talked about experiments he did that didn't seem to be done out of malice, but rather out of a clinical curiosity that was even more disturbing. He thought of himself as a scholar, someone who would go into areas that others thought were morally wrong in order to learn more. He thought that social norms and moral limits were fake barriers that made it hard to really understand. He wrote in his notes that he did what he did because he thought that people who didn't have strong family ties or were itinerant workers without roots were resources that society wasted and that he could use for better ends. It was shocking how coldly he talked about these ideas. The texts were cold and didn't show any emotion or recognize the pain his actions had caused. It was like reading the diaries of someone who had completely lost touch with what it means to be human and had turned people into nothing more than objects of study. As Brennan flipped through those notebooks, he started to feel more and more sick. He realized that the person he was dealing with wasn't just a normal criminal who was angry or greedy. They had built an entire philosophy to explain their actions. They found letters among the papers that showed unexpected links. Thornwood stayed in touch with other people who liked dark things like he did. There were letters from rogue doctors, researchers who had been kicked out of universities for unethical behavior, and people who lived on the fringes of society. They shared information, talked about theories, and talked about what they had found. It was a secret group of people who had decided to give up all moral limits in order to learn things they thought were too difficult for regular science to find. One of the letters gave a lot of information. It was written in 1916 by someone who only gave their name as Dr. Silas and lived somewhere in Louisiana. He praised Thornwood for having the guts to do work that others would think was wrong, and he talked about his own work in similar areas. He said he would soon go to Hollow Ridge to see the buildings Thornwood had built for himself. The letter made it seem like the visit really happened because Thornwood wrote back months later to thank him for the advice and talk about the changes he had made based on the visitor's suggestions. The deputies also found a very detailed map of the property that was much more complete than any official record. It marked all the hidden buildings in the woods and wrote down what each one was for. There were strange symbols next to some places, codes that Brennan couldn't figure out right away. The map showed that they had only found a small part of what was on those lands. At least 6 other buildings that were buried or hidden had not yet been found. It was decided that Thornwood would be arrested right away, and that a bigger group would be put together to search the property thoroughly. One of the deputies rode off on horseback to get more help, while the other stayed behind to watch the prisoner. Brennan used the last few hours of daylight to check out another area shown on the map. He walked alone along a path that led to a deep ravine that was covered in thick plants. There, he found another underground room, this one even more complicated than the last ones. A layer of stones and branches covered the entrance, making it look like a natural pile of trash. But when this covering was taken off, a wooden door with metal reinforcements was revealed. Brennan broke down the door and walked down steps of packed dirt into a big room that had been dug out of the ground. There were wooden supports for the walls, and the ceiling was low enough that he had to bend his head slightly. There were oil lamps hanging from hooks that still had fuel in them, which meant that the place had been used recently. What he found inside was both interesting and scary, a kind of makeshift lab with tools that looked like they had been borrowed from medical and industrial settings. There were workbenches with tools arranged with obsessive care, containers full of preserved liquids that Brennan didn't want to look too closely at, and shelves full of detailed records, each labeled with a date and a reference number. It was clear that Thornwood had spent years building that secret space, making it better and adding to what it could do. Brennan gathered some of the records and started to read them by the light of his own flashlight. The texts talked about things that had been going on for more than 10 years. Thornwood kept careful records of everything, including variables, results, and conclusions. There were tables that showed the pros and cons of different methods, graphs that showed how things changed over time, and notes about things that affected the results of his experiments. It was like reading the work of a dedicated scientist, but the subjects were people, and the methods were completely unethical by any standard. When Brennan came out of that underground room, it was already completely dark over Hollow Ridge. The stars shone with strange brightness on the mountains, which weren't affected by the artificial light that was starting to change the bigger cities. He walked back to the main house with a box of papers that he thought were important to the case. The main question in his mind was how something like this could have stayed hidden for so long. How could an entire community think something was going on in those lands, be afraid of it, but never do anything about it? He was starting to understand that the answer lay in the victims themselves. Thornwood hired temporary workers who didn't have families, people who moved around looking for seasonal work, and people who had cut ties with their home communities. People who would not have organized searches for them if they went missing, and whose disappearance would be explained by their nomadic lifestyle. Thornwood had thought carefully about who to choose, only picking people whose disappearance would go unnoticed or be easy to explain. And when someone with stronger ties went missing, there was a way to erase records to hide the proof. But who had helped Thornwood change the official records? As Brennan thought about everything he had learned, this question kept coming back to him. The rancher couldn't have done it by himself. He would have needed help from people in local institutions who were willing to look the other way or help with the cover-up. And he would have needed a strong reason to get them to help him, like money. Thornwood had a lot of money, but no one ever really explained where it came from. But maybe there were also threats, intimidation, and the kind of silent pressure that small towns are used to. When he got back to the house, he saw that the deputy was watching Thornwood in the main room. The prisoner was sitting in a chair with his hands tied, but he looked strangely calm. Thornwood looked up and spoke for the first time in hours when Brennan came in. He said that the investigator was making a big mistake by judging his actions by what most people think is right and wrong. He said that there were many examples in history of people who were condemned at the time, but later seen as visionaries. He also said that knowledge always required sacrifices, and that future generations would understand how important what he had tried to do was. The speech showed how deeply Thornwood's mind was warped. He really thought he was helping with something bigger, and that science would eventually prove that what he did was right. He didn't feel sorry. He was just angry that he had to stop what he thought was his work. Brennan listened without saying a word, knowing that he was talking to someone who didn't care about other people's feelings at all. Thornwood had built up a wall of self-justification around himself that no logical argument could get through. The night went on and on. The deputy who had gone to get help wouldn't be back until the next morning, so all they could do was wait. Brennan took the time to look more closely at the papers he had gathered. He found something among them that changed how he saw the whole thing. The letter was from someone named Mentor and was dated 1904. It was cryptic but revealing, talking about how important it was to choose the right place to study, how important it was to be alone and discreet, and how to make sure that neighbors didn't find out or didn't care. The letter implied that Thornwood had not devised his actions autonomously. Someone else with similar experience had told him what to do, trained him, and gotten him ready. And, even more troubling, the letter suggested that there were others like him, living in different remote areas, all doing their own creepy research while being cut off from the rest of the world. Brennan had no idea how big the network was. It was an invisible community of people with interests that civilized society completely rejected. This discovery changed the case from an investigation into a single criminal to something that could be much bigger. If Thornwood was part of a larger group, then catching him could lead to more discoveries and places that needed to be looked into. But it also meant danger. People with power and money might try to protect their own interests by silencing witnesses and destroying evidence. Brennan knew he had to be very careful about what to do next, who to tell what, and who he could trust within the official structures. The sound of horses at dawn told everyone that reinforcements were on their way. The deputy came back with Sheriff Harrove and 4 other men. Harrove looked shaken, as if a part of him had hoped the suspicions would never be true. He gave Thornwood a look that was a mix of anger and something like sadness. He might have wished he had done something years ago when Martin Dalton came to him with disturbing news. Maybe he felt guilty about the lives that could have been saved if he had been brave enough to do a proper investigation. The larger team started a methodical search of the whole property, using the map they had found as a guide. They found all of the marked hidden structures over the next few days, as well as some that weren't even on the list. Every new piece of information helped them understand more about what Thornwood had built there. It wasn't just a bunch of random hiding spots. It was a carefully planned and built complex that took more than 10 years to build. The way the buildings were set up made sense, and each one had a clear purpose. One of the most disturbing things we found was a building that looked like it had been used as an archive. It had detailed records of Thornwood's own actions as well as letters with other people in his network. These records included names, locations, and descriptions of similar work being done in places as far apart as the Oregon mountains and the Florida swamps. The size of the network was shocking. Brennan realized he had proof of a conspiracy that was going on all over the country and would last forever in the shadows. But things were getting worse. As more and more evidence came in and the case grew in importance, Brennan began to notice some local officials subtly pushing back. They suggested that it might be better to keep some information private, that too much publicity could hurt the area, and that some evidence was too vague to be useful. He saw the signs of an attempted containment, which was meant to keep the investigation from getting to people or institutions that would rather stay hidden. At that moment, Brennan had to make a very important choice. He started making copies of everything he thought was important before anyone could mess with the evidence. He worked late into the night by lamplight, writing down everything in his own notebooks, copying maps, and transcribing documents by hand. He sent encrypted messages to trusted people in other areas, people outside of his local sphere of influence, who could keep information safe in case something happened to him. It was a safety measure that might seem paranoid, but later events would show that it was smart. Thornwood was formally arrested and would await trial in the county jail, but his demeanor remained disconcertingly calm. He seemed convinced that somehow the legal process wouldn't truly catch up with him. When questioned about this confidence, he merely smiled enigmatically and said that there were preparations he had made, contingencies that would come into play when necessary. Brennan interpreted this as a reference to his network of associates, people with a vested interest in protecting one of their own to avoid exposure of the larger operation. And indeed, strange things began to happen. Documents that Brennan had left in the custody of the police station disappeared overnight, despite locked doors and supposedly constant surveillance. A strange fire burned down part of the barn where physical evidence was being kept for a short time. Witnesses who had promised to give statements suddenly changed their minds, and some left the area without warning. It was evident that unseen forces were actively working to sabotage the investigation. To his credit, Sheriff Harrove fought against this interference. He had finally found the strength to face the fears that had kept him from doing anything for years, and he was determined to see justice done. But he was just a man in a vulnerable position, dependent on compromised local structures. One night, he sought out Brennan privately and admitted that he was receiving pressure from prominent figures in the region. Influential businessmen, landowners, even a member of the state government had made contact, suggesting that it would be better for everyone if the case were resolved discreetly, without much publicity or in-depth investigation. Brennan realized he couldn't rely solely on local authorities. He used his federal position to request direct support from superiors in Washington. He sent detailed reports, including copies of the most significant evidence, requesting intervention from higher levels of government. But the answer was disappointingly slow and full of red tape. There were procedures to follow, jurisdictions to respect, political sensitivities to consider. The machinery of the federal government, so powerful in theory, proved cumbersome and hesitant when confronted with something that challenged established categories. Meanwhile, the Hollow Ridge community reacted in complex and contradictory ways. Some residents expressed shock and horror upon learning of the extent of Thornwood's activities, swearing they never suspected anything so serious. Others admitted they always knew something was wrong but had no idea how to proceed or who to turn to. Some people also pushed for a twisted kind of local loyalty, saying that problems in a region should be fixed by the region itself, without help from outside. This last group was small but loud, which made the investigation even harder by creating a tense atmosphere. One of the most eye-opening parts was when Brennan decided to find some of the workers who had left the Thornwood farm years before and, contrary to what everyone thought, were still alive and living somewhere else. He found 3 of them by looking through employment records and letters. He went to see them in person to talk to them, hoping they could tell him firsthand what they had seen or done while they were at Hollow Ridge. The talks were both helpful and annoying at the same time. The 3 men agreed that there was something very wrong on the farm. They talked about how oppressive the place felt, the sounds that came from places that weren't allowed at night, and the constant feeling of being watched. One of them said they saw medical or surgical equipment through a partially open window of one of the sheds. This was very strange for a rural farm. Another person told a story about how he woke up in the middle of the night because he was thirsty and left the workers' quarters. He saw lights moving towards the forest. He followed at a distance, curious, and saw Thornwood and 2 other men he didn't know go into one of the hidden buildings. They were carrying boxes and tools and working quietly like people who were used to doing the same thing. The testimony also included accounts of how other workers' behavior had changed. A man who was happy and friendly became quiet and anxious after being told to work on a certain part of the property. Another person just vanished one night, and the next morning, Thornwood said that he had made the decision to leave suddenly, even though he had left behind all of his things, including weeks' worth of work savings. Whitley said that at the time, he believed these explanations because he had no reason to doubt them. However, looking back, the patterns were clearly strange. With this testimony, Brennan tried again to get a wider investigation into the network that Thornwood was a part of. He said that only looking at the runaway farmer was ignoring a much bigger problem in the system. There were other people doing the same things, and they were safe because of the same ways of keeping people apart and getting them to do what they wanted that had let Thornwood stay in business for so long. But higher-ups didn't seem very interested in the answer. They admitted there was a problem, but they said they didn't have enough resources. The laws were too complicated, and it was hard to build cases against people who were working on private property far away. Brennan was starting to see the truth, which was painful for him to accept. The system wasn't ready, or maybe not motivated enough to handle this kind of crime. Crimes that happened in the dark, against people who were already on the fringes, and in places that most people would rather not think about, didn't get the help and attention they needed. There was an institutional inertia that made it easier to leave some things buried. This wasn't necessarily because people were mean, but because it was easier and people tend to avoid facing uncomfortable truths. Brennan was angry but not defeated when he made a choice that would shape the rest of his career. He would start writing down everything he had learned in great detail, making a record that could be used in future investigations, even if the current one didn't come to satisfactory conclusions. He spent whole nights putting together evidence, making connections between different cases and people, and making a map of the network that was both real and figurative. He knew he might not be able to finish the job in his lifetime, but it could give others a place to start. In the years that followed, Hollow Ridge changed without anyone noticing. The empty house on the hill became part of the landscape in a new way. It was no longer a home, but a place that was only remembered by a few people. As time went on, buildings started to fall apart. Wood rotted, roofs fell in, and walls leaned at angles that seemed impossible for gravity to hold them up. Eventually, they gave up completely. Nature, patient and unyielding, took back every inch that the farmer had once owned. Brennan kept working for a few more years, but the search became less intense over time. He didn't give up. He just learned that some stories don't have good endings. Some questions are still up in the air, like mountain mist. You can see them, but not touch them. And they are there, but you can't grab them. He kept his files in order and added new information when he got it. But his initial obsession turned into a quieter, more lasting determination. Over the years, rumors would sometimes come from faraway places. A traveler would swear he saw a man who looked like Thornwood at a train station in the middle of nowhere. A merchant would talk about a single customer who didn't say much and always paid with old coins. But every time these threads were pulled, they came apart into memories that didn't make sense and weren't sure. It was like trying to catch smoke with your hands. It always went away as soon as you thought you had something solid. Like other small towns, Hollow Ridge learned to live with the ghosts of its past, not by fighting them head-on or fully processing them, but by slowly and quietly accepting them. People stopped talking about the farmer on the hill, but that didn't mean they forgot. It was more like keeping something painful inside themselves and being aware of it without letting it take over the present. Life went on, as it had to, with its seasons, its harvests, its births, and its natural goodbyes. Sheriff Harrove carried the burden of his past doubts until the end of his life. There were nights when he sat by himself and looked at the mountains, thinking about the choices he had made and the ones he had avoided. He thought about whether things would have been different if he had taken more decisive action years earlier. There are no real answers to these questions, only endless guesses that go around in circles. He never talked about these thoughts in public, but people who knew him well could see the change and the heavy burden he was carrying. The underground chambers and hidden buildings in the forest slowly became part of the stories people told. But every time it was told, the details changed. What was scary became strange. What was clear became unclear, and what was real became mixed with what was imagined. This is how group memories work, especially when it comes to things that people don't want to think about too much. The truth stays hidden under layers of new interpretations until only legends are left. Thornwood, wherever he was, became less of a person and more of a concept. He stood for something about the dark places that exist not only in the world but also in people's lives, the places where decisions are made without witnesses, where people can break the rules without facing immediate consequences, and where people who are far away from organized society can take advantage of their freedom. He was an example, maybe one of a kind in his own way, but he was also an example of a bigger trend that was happening on the edges. Brennan, in the last years of his career before he retired, started to see the Hollow Ridge case not as a personal failure, but as a lesson about how human systems can fail. There will always be gaps in the law, no matter how well it is written or how hard the institutions work. There will always be places that aren't protected or watched over by the network. This isn't because of a design flaw, but because it's impossible to be everywhere at once, see everything, and fully protect against people who want to work in the shadows. He gave his files to his successors in the hopes that they would be useful for future investigations or at least serve as a record of what had been found and what was still unknown. Some of these younger detectives were interested and followed some leads for a while, but eventually they got busy with other cases and other things that needed their attention. The network that Thornwood was a part of, if it really existed to the extent that the evidence suggested, was too strong, too spread out, and had enough layers of secrecy and influence to keep it from being fully exposed. For decades, the property itself stayed empty. People would sometimes say that it should be sold so that the land could be used for something useful. But there was always a hesitation, an unexplained reluctance to take possession of something that had seen so much bad stuff happen. It was as if the place had a reputation that made it impossible to touch, not by law, but by an unspoken agreement among everyone. And so it stayed that way, slowly returning to the forest and becoming part of the landscape. One day, maybe, there will be no difference between what people made and what has always been nature. The stories continued to exist in broken-up forms. Historians who were interested in the area's quirks, or just people who were curious because of rumors, would ask questions. The older people told what they knew or what they wanted to share, but they always did so with the hesitation that comes from talking about things they would rather forget. Younger generations only knew watered-down versions of the stories, which had lost their original clarity and gained parts that made them easier to tell, or just more fun to tell. In the end, Hollow Ridge is a reflection on the spaces between what we know and what we don't know, between what we can prove and what we can only guess. It reminds us that not all stories have clear and satisfying endings. Some things will always be open, with loose ends that will never be tied up and questions that will never be fully answered. And maybe that's a good thing. Realizing that uncertainty is a part of being human and that not everything can or should be fully understood. The mist still falls on those mountains, as it always has, not caring about the human dramas that happened under its temporary cover. In their natural cycles, trees grow and die. Ravines are where streams flow, slowly wearing down stone over time. And in this landscape that goes on without human stories, there are still traces of what used to be. They are no longer useful or important to daily life, but they are still there, preserved by time and distance.